Casey Rosengren is an executive coach and community builder based in New York City. He's a behaviorist, providing coaching to startup founders using evidence-based practices from behavioral psychology.
I'm Cameron Trimble, CEO of Convergence, and I'm super excited to be talking today to Casey Rosengren, who is up to really cool things. And we were connected via a friend, Casper Kyle, who, when Casper heard about this summit and what we were trying to pursue, this question of the future of spirituality, Casper said, "Oh no, you need to talk to Casey." So here we are having a conversation. So thank you for the time, and tell us about you and your work.
Yeah, so I think the two projects that are probably most relevant for this audience, one is called Open Div, which is exploring the idea, what does it mean to take divinity school out of kind of the ivory tower and really try and make it accessible to the masses, and particularly kind of like the electives in divinity school, but currently the electives, studying stuff around like the nuns, secularizing spirituality. And we started last year with a summit where we interviewed maybe 75 different academics, theologians, and people from kind of like secular psychology of religion departments, and really just exploring this question of what does modern divinity look like? How are people making meaning, whether that's in progressive spiritual spaces, whether that's in CrossFit boxes that maybe begin to blur the lines between a gym and a church, including explicitly Christian CrossFit boxes that exist out there in the world. And then the other project I'm working on, which is potentially relevant, is called Formation. And it started back in early 2020, about 6 weeks pre-COVID, with the kind of question of what would it mean to create a secular-friendly kind of contemplative group, Container for Formation, that is really explicitly meant for the nuns, but is kind of modeled a little bit after like the small group format, or like the kind of like dinner church format. So that's inspired really by the Church of the Savior in DC, which is a really cool church that's spun out a lot of nonprofits. And we kind of like took some of their commitments and some of the way they do small groups, as written by Killian No, who wrote about this book called Descent into Love, and really kind of like adapted that as a practice-based spiritual formation container as opposed to like a belief-based spiritual formation container. So those are the two big projects. I'm happy to kind of like talk about, to go deeper into either or both. Yeah.
Well, they're both fantastic, and the links to those projects are on the page where you're watching this video. How did you get into this? Like, where did you come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of two threads that have kind of come together. The first thread is I started back in 2014 a travel community, and we were kind of doing trips around the world. It was a completely secular community, but the more our kind of like culture as a community developed, the more it began to feel like we were creating something that was kind of like religion-y in nature. You know, there were kind of inside jokes, there were stories that were told from trip to trip. And this kind of got me interested in really thinking back on some of my own experiences in spiritual spaces of what could be kind of drawn towards this. And it wasn't until I left that community, I ran it for 3 years and passed on the torch. But when I left, I was given two books that really kind of dove into this. One was The Purpose-Driven Church by Rick Warren, which was like the most sophisticated thinking on community I'd read to date. And the other was A Hidden Wholeness by Parker Palmer, which kind of is a secularization of some Quaker practices. And the combination of these two things made me realize that, you know, what I cared about less was just community, and more about how do you create communities that are not just about bringing people together, but they can really be communities of meaning that can help people grapple with the fact that we live and must die, and can kind of like help them. We can really engage with people on a deeper level. So I ended up reading a lot of my own, auditing some kind of like seminary courses here in New York City, and really kind of going down a rabbit hole of like, how could I give myself some of like a traditional divinity education, even though the things I was interested in were typically the things at the margin of the divinity school curricula. That in particular is kind of where Open Div kind of spun out of, where originally I was almost like creating for myself what like a self-directed master's might look like, and then launched the project as a way to have public conversations with all the people whose papers I was reading and whose work I really respected. And then to kind of share that with others, because in talking with folks, like Casper and Angie, I think really kind of put their finger on the pulse of a trend that was happening in a really meaningful way. And I've talked to community people, I've talked to people in like arts and governments who are all really excited about the How We Gather report, and kind of like everyone's kind of siloed. And so part of the kind of vision for Open Div is to start bringing people together. But the kind of second thread that brought me to this work is I grew up Unitarian Universalist and was pretty agnostic, somewhat atheist. And then at 21, I basically got sober and ended up in a 12-step program and or 12-step community, and not really knowing anything about that as a spiritual community, but without knowing it, got involved in a basically fundamentalist 12-step group that's like the book of AA is the word of God, and like a very like meaningful community experience for me. And also like ideologically over time just didn't kind of resonate. And so, as I was kind of doing these community experiments in the secular world, I was also kind of really grasping and taking these divinity school courses, I was like grasping for like, to try and understand what about that experience kind of didn't resonate, and what would it mean to try and create a container that could be as meaningful as kind of like that weekly meeting small group, and really, but with maybe a bit more of like a life-giving or accessible kind of belief system as I was with kind of the rest of my worldview, which is no longer, I would say, agnostic atheist is not what I claim now. I'd say I'm somewhere in like contemplative, mystic, unlabeled, but yeah, that's kind of what brought me to this specific interest.
Yes. Thank goodness for all of our sakes that you got there. So the topic of our conversation, or the question that we're holding together, is what is the future of spirituality? And what I so appreciate about your journey is that you were honest in your own self about what has been life-giving to you, what has been life-taking, what has drawn you closer to encountering sacred in life, what has actually been a barrier to that, and then creating, or like marking your own path, and then sharing it with the rest of us, which is really, really refreshing. When I ask you this question, like, what is the future of spirituality? What are the contours that you see that are obvious to you, maybe not obvious to the rest of us, but that are clear for you to move forward?
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that come to mind. I'd say 3 things that come to mind around this question. The first is there's a researcher at who is a professor emeritus, I think at UC Santa Barbara, Ann Taves, who's done a lot of work on this idea of religions as belonging to a super category of worldviews. And it's this idea that like a religion is one kind of worldview. It answers a number of like philosophical questions, but it's kind of, it's a little its own animal, but it's also kind of can be similar to like political worldviews or other philosophies. And people can kind of hold on to those other worldviews in much the same way. But she lays out these kind of 6 philosophical questions that worldviews answer. Things like epistemology, how does knowledge, how do we know what's true? Ontology, what exists? Cosmology, how did we get here? These kinds of things. Praxeology, like what should we do? And I've noticed that the kind of like 2 areas where traditional religion tends to alienate a lot of more secular people is in epistemology, cosmology, and maybe also ontology, right? These stories of how we got here, can we hold to those as kind of myths and metaphors that are maybe informative but not literal truth? And then, epistemology, where are we going for meaning? Are we kind of just going to one sacred text, maybe one tradition? Or are we beginning to pull from kind of other places? And I was talking to a Buddhist teacher more recently who was saying at this one retreat center in Massachusetts, IMS, the Insight Meditation Society, it kind of 20 years ago, it would have been, you were just hearing kind of like really traditional, like monastic Buddhist text reference and like other teachers referenced. And now I was on a retreat there last week, and they were quoting Greg Boyle, who's, a Jesuit priest, and they were pulling in braiding sweetgrass. And there's this real, I think, beginning to kind of like intermingle wisdom, and this idea that, there is wisdom in all traditions, and there's kind of maybe some a limiting if we just only go on one. Not that there's not benefit in going deep within one tradition, but that can be this kind of openness to pulling from different sources. So that's kind of like one of the things that I see, and even like in the modern, like Buddhist or other worlds, where like Richard Rohr, I think, is a great example in the Christian space of someone who kind of will pull from, will pull Joseph Campbell, will pull from Jung, will pull from like a Buddhist text, and then we'll kind of like quote the Bible. And I think that kind of way of relating to the faith is really accessible. Yeah, so the second thing I really think about is kind of like orthopraxy versus orthodoxy, where traditionally religious communities have really gathered around core belief systems, shared beliefs. And if one wants to access a community that really supports these kind of shared practices for accessing the sacred, that's also often been coupled with a belief system that sometimes for some people is more accessible than others, and kind of metaphors for why those work. And so we're trying to do information right now is really focus on the orthopraxy, like what are the real kind of behaviors and commitments that we think kind of lead people towards growing in the heart and kind of contacting the sacred. And for us, this is again directly inspired from the Church of the Savior. These are things like spending a specific amount of time each day in silence, being part of a small group and allowing yourself to be kind of deeply known and loved in that group, connecting with people across lines of difference and using that time to nurture authentic friendships, caring for the self, the mind, body, and spirit, kind of being generous with one's resources and time and energy. And then we were like this kind of metaphor of the inward outward journey, kind of using one's gifts and brokenness to meet the world's deep needs and having that be the kind of ultimate goal of spiritual practice or spiritual deepening, as opposed to self-actualization or something more kind of like navel gazing. So really, I think, I think there will be like variants, if you will, of all of the wisdom traditions that, really try and take what is it that really is the crux of what is helping us access the sacred in this tradition, and can we find ways for understanding the rest and for relating to, not saying to throw everything else out, but maybe to kind of find more flexible ways of engaging with some of the stories, some of the traditions, some of the legalistic aspects of a faith that kind of allow for someone who maybe wasn't raised in that tradition or is maybe has trauma in another spiritual community to find more access within the community. And then the third thing I'll just say is money, is the question that comes up for me around the future of spirituality. I was fortunate to meet someone who works at the Center for Contemplation and Action in December, which is kind of a Richard Rohr's kind of school around modern contemplative Christianity. And someone asked the question of like, do you think, like, what do you think the biggest challenge is for secular or kind of like these like, spiritual non-religious kind of to gather in community? And as someone who's coming from a more traditional Christian context, I was assuming, maybe there's like some aspect that religion has that, that you really miss in a more secular space. And for him, he responded, money is the biggest question, because like traditional institutions, the real strength that they have is just this momentum, and he kind of like assets and the ability to, like, a new church, from what I understand, might get like 3 years of funding from traditional backers, depending on the tradition. And definitely if you're doing stuff outside of the tradition that's like newer, that doesn't really exist. And if you look at like AA as an example, the founder of AA was kind of like derelict for a lot of his life and really made all of his money through royalties on the book Alcoholics Anonymous, which they self-published. And as a community, that community, as they're donation based, from what I understand, has had a harder time being financially solvent over the years, as more and more people are using the digital versions of those books, which are often freely available, as opposed to buying the physical stuff, which is a large source of funding for the organization. And likewise, even within existing traditions, if people are wanting to do something like too progressive, I put this in quotes, or something that's like too new, there's often kind of like a party line that needs to be walked to have access to traditional funding sources. And so I think one of the biggest questions for now, and how do we really move into this moment we're in, and how do we kind of really cultivate the new and see what really is meaningful and what can have depth, is figuring out how do you kind of fund people to work on it. So that's
well, you're naming something that in the for-profit world, most companies, especially companies at scale, have what they call research and development arms. And so they're the people who are out there trying to create the next shiny object that can be commoditized and sold for the company. And when you look at not the nonprofit sector in general, but certainly in faith denominational systems, we don't have research and development arms adequately developed. I mean, we throw what are now pennies at certain projects, but then there's also no way to feed back in the learning into the institution. So even the projects that, like yours, are right at that edge and really leading us forward, the ways in which those institutions can learn from what you're doing, that infrastructure to feed back in those lessons isn't shored up in a lot of these traditions. So I couldn't agree more, actually, that we're not invested in a longer game. The imagination of a lot of our institutions is now shrinking actually down to survival instead of pioneering the kind of future that that we could actually be architects of, instead of maybe victims of. I love that what you have helped us understand are some really big theological questions that are the boundaries, or are helping to set some boundaries for a coherent conversation about the future of spirituality. And I'm really struck that there seem to be 3 areas that are really important based on your experience and based on your own intuition, and then based on the study that you've done. And you've got them up on your site, which we'll put a link to, but contemplation, community, and contribution, which to some extent kind of outline what you've just talked about there. So help me make sure I'm hearing clearly that it's the intersection of those 3, but it's the deepening of those 3, of our understanding and engagement in those 3 areas that actually create the health that is needed in any kind of vibrant spiritual movement going forward.
And I think, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just saying, do I have that? Am I sensing that correctly, or am I reading that?
And so that is an adaptation of, there's a church in Tampa called the Underground, and they're in many ways a kind of innovation incubation hub, where they launched micro churches that look vastly different than like the traditional church. There might be a bike shop where, but they see it as a church, a micro church, and they might have like the traditional is like it has worship, community, mission was what they originally wrote. So like they'll have time to come together as employees and like worship. They'll have a community, like it won't just be a bike shop. You'll have really this kind of employee community and a mission. So that example in particular, they will kind of offer bikes to people who are homeless, who don't have cars, to allow them to maybe commute to jobs that they wouldn't have access to without transportation. And so for them, they took this thing that like, you go to any old bike shop on the corner, you wouldn't think this is necessarily a church. But if it kind of has these elements of worship, community, mission, then it kind of is a church, is what they're saying. It meets their ecclesial minimum, or the minimum viable church. So, call it pulling from like this concept from the tech world of minimum viable product. But, and as someone who's kind of created community more in the secular world, wanted to offer kind of a framework for other people who are doing communities that maybe blur the lines between what is a church or a community of meaning, of spirituality versus just like a community that's gathering around a hobby of some sort. Or maybe for people who are starting out doing something that's more ostensibly quote unquote secular, but really want to begin to tap into something that's more meaningful and want it to offer it as a container of formation. And so for them, pulling in these 3 elements of contemplation, some kind of like practice that deepens one's connection to the sacred, whether that's, a God as one understands it, or a sense of kind of like the inner teacher, the soul, kind of there's, whatever language resonates. Community, having it be really about this kind of connection to others, and then contribution. What is like the impact that whatever one is doing can be in service of? And, I think there's also authors in the Christian world, like Thomas Bandy has written an interesting book called Kicking Habits that talks about basically applying a very similar model to declining churches as a way to bring more life into the community. And I think, any congregation or whether a community, whether it's a formal congregation or kind of one of these upstart communities, what I often see is that folks will fall into just community maybe, or maybe it's just community and like worship. And I think really, it's when you get those three things all kind of moving that there's a real sense of growth and meaning that really feeds on each other, right? The kind of contemplation of the worship gives energy, the community kind of keeps one connected, and kind of there's places to also tap into when one is feeling under-resourced, and the mission is kind of what it's all about. So, yeah.
So in our conversation earlier, one of the questions that was behind, or that was sort of echoing in my mind, was you were making the observation that a lot of our systems, a lot of our ways that we would connect to each other, that they were, these are my words, not yours, but that they were needing to be rescripted, needing to be reimagined. And I was hearing behind it because the mythology, the theology that has gotten us this far is not sufficient to take us further, that there's a deepening of the theological work that needs to be done. And ultimately, I'm finding myself wondering if, in fact, it's because the boundaries that we have held for who belongs and who doesn't, and what belongs and what doesn't, and what to believe and what not to believe, and that those boundaries are being eroded by the globalization, by the diversity that we're needing to incorporate now into this modern life. And so I'm thinking about like a little local church who probably was formed in the, I don't know, maybe the 50s, 60s, or maybe even 300 years ago, but, points to its heydays of the 50s and 60s. But, they were formed in these kind of tight belonging groups. A lot of them look alike. A lot of these congregations attract people who have shared beliefs, shared practices, shared race, shared values, and so they're very homogenous. What I'm hearing in you, though, is an invitation to actually hold to that impulse to belong to each other, but a radical kind of opening, or like a questioning maybe of who belongs and how do we belong to each other.
Yeah. One of the things that there's two thoughts that come up to me around that. Like, one is, and again, this guy, Tom Bandy, writes that if a church is really focused on belonging, it'll be really oriented towards protecting the belonging that exists within its walls. And that can lead to like standoffishness with outsiders and really kind of a more homogenous culture, because they're, it's like, does this person fit? We don't want to rock the boat because what we're trying to protect is this community experience. Versus if kind of it's not just the community, but the community and mission, then part of it's not just this kind of connection that's bringing people together, but it's this shared connection to a broader mission, to meaning. And that's something that wants to be shared. Like, meaning, a mission shared with others is a mission strengthened. A community shared with others who are different is potentially a sense of like dilution of what maybe originally pulled people together. So I think that there's a real need to really emphasize the like, well, what are we really here for? Can we be about something more than just connecting with the people within our community? And the second thing I'll just say that I think is hard about this particular moment for existing churches, in addition to all COVID and everything else, is the rise of podcasts and kind of like great living spiritual teachers kind of building these massive audiences. And for example, I like in the Buddhist tradition, I dabble in different spiritual spaces, but there's one teacher out of DC who I've sat like about retreats with, listened to her podcast, Tara Brach, who's like a really loving, affirming, interfaith, really friendly, like mindfulness orientation. And you go to the local kind of like Buddhist meditation center to sit, and it's still this like very much one-to-many experience. And it's also people who are not, have not had either the time, the capital, their thought is not such that they could gather a global or national audience, right? And so you have this thing where like the person in the meditation center here is now competing with Tara Brach, who's like, national bestseller, is really refined her thinking and is putting out a weekly talk that anyone in the world can consume, right? And so I think there's also this trend towards our locals, and that exists in other traditions as well. Televangelism has been around for a while within the Christian world, but also, more progressive, pastors, ministers, like the liturgists or things like that, who do not have access to like a maybe national television audience, are still reaching lots of people through like podcasts. And so I think the local congregational experience, while it maybe in the past was based around kind of like sharing and this like one-to-many expert relationship, needs to move more towards peer-based, and really, because it's about community and it's about going out into the world, because those are the two things a podcast can't do for you. But if it's just about kind of like, I want to understand this like theological concept, or I want to be inspired by a certain message, the chance that I've got the chance that there's someone on a podcast who can do it better than the person on my, at my corner congregation is a lot better. And then there's not to say that there's not room for all different types of people, different voices, but I think it's particularly challenging, especially if for maybe more traditional congregations that are trying to reach people who are getting their spiritual dosage through like On Being or some of these other they've got the yearning for something spiritual, but they're not finding that same conversation locally.
I think that's brilliant. I think that is, if every person leading an institution right now or congregation could hear that last little line to refocus on what the point is of this, that's super helpful. And it's a great excuse to lean into, you're trying this out kind of at broad scale. And if I understand correctly, there's a way that a lot of us could join up and try this with you. Is that what you're
so we're just getting to that point. So we've had a group going for the last 2 years in New York that's kind of really been experimenting with this like orthopraxy based spirituality. If you sign up for our mailing list at Open Div, we're going to be sending out information when we've got something public, or you can sign up for my newsletter at humanmissives.com. And really, we're just beginning to kind of compile all the documentation of what we've kind of been doing, which is in many ways a combination of some kind of UU values with kind of some Buddhist inspiration practices, a real Christian emphasis on mission and love. Even a little Pentecostal kind of emphasis on like real, what does it mean to bring joy into the practice, and Quaker practice, because we kind of pull a lot from Parker Palmer and all that. And so really it's been an exploration of like, what does it mean to create secular friendly containers for spiritual formation? And the idea is not necessarily they have to be secular, but that by using kind of like secular language as a baseline, that they can also be interfaith accessible. So instead of using like the language and stories of one tradition, we can pull from multiple traditions. We can read Rumi one week and Heschel the next, and Rohr or any of these others, and then Dr. King. We can pull from not just spiritual sources of wisdom, but also activism and philosophy and poetry.
Well, from the fullness of humanity, which of course is all part of sacred creation. So it makes all the sense in the world. I want to be in on this. So I will be signing up for all the things. I just think this is brilliant. I think you're brilliant. I am so grateful that our lives have connected. So,
I'm glad to.
So let me ask one final question for this conversation, though I hope many more to come. As you think about the future of spirituality and you're kind of looking out at that horizon, is there one word that comes to mind that could be like a guidepost for the rest of us that says, hey, I think this is kind of the way that we're moving, and here's the thing we need to hold on to? Is there one word for you?
The word that's coming to mind, and maybe interpreting the question a little differently, is just garden, where I feel like we're all kind of in the shared garden, and like it's unclear what these like sprouts might go into. And again, it's not like we need to like force create it, but it's like how can we kind of like create the circumstances, the context in which things can grow, and then see what comes out of the seeds that are kind of here. And there are going to be lots of different types of flowers and different types of plants, and they'll look different, they'll have different fruit, but it's all kind of, life's
a thriving ecosystem. I love it. Oh my gosh, this has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. I'm really excited to see all the other talks. Yeah, check it out.